Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Edward Davey. I'm co-head of WRI in the UK, and it's my great honour and privilege to welcome Katharine Hayhoe to a Green Alliance event. Good morning, Katharine, and good morning to you in Texas, I believe.
That's right. Good morning and good to see you and everyone here.
I trust you've had your first cup of coffee for the day.
Tea, actually.
Tea, well, there we go. For those of you who don't know Katharine, Katharine's a climate scientist and chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. She's also the endowed professor in public policy and public law and Paul W. Horn Distinguished Professor at Texas Tech University. She's been named a United Nations Champion of the Earth and is one of Time's 100 most influential people. She serves as the climate ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. Katharine was a lead author for the US 2nd, 3rd, and 4th National Climate Assessments, hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding, and writes for the New York Times. Her TED Talk, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has been viewed over 5 million times. She has a BSc in Physics and Astronomy from the University of Toronto, and an MS and a PhD in Atmospheric Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's also the author of Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. And I'm going to be interviewing Katharine about her book today, and then we're going to open it up for questions from our virtual audience. So Katharine, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today for this Green Alliance event. I wanted to start by asking you to set the scene for your book and give us a sense of what's contained in this book.
Thank you so much, Ed. Well, before I explain why I wrote the book, I wanted to ask you all a question. And here's how we're going to do it. And you're going to be able to ask Ed and I your questions using the same way in a few minutes. But let me just share my screen with you first. And what I need you to do is you can use this QR code, or you can on your phone, or you can type in pollev.com/Katharine. They should put the link in the chat as well. There it is. And when you go there, I want you to go ahead and in one word, I want you to tell me, how do you feel about climate change? When someone says climate change to you, how do you feel? What's a word that sort of expresses your emotional reaction to hearing about climate change? And it has to be one word because this is a Wordle. So this is a question that I started asking people around the world a few years ago, because when I spoke with people in the UK, in North America, anywhere else around the world, I started to hear the same question again and again. And that question that I was hearing everywhere I went from almost anyone you can imagine was, where do we find hope? Or the flip side of it, are we screwed? So what you're saying here, that you feel terrified and anxious, exhausted, angry, scared, frightened, disillusioned, furious, worried, this is how we all feel. What you are feeling is what people are feeling in Canada, what people are feeling in Spain, what people are feeling in Japan, what people are feeling in India, and definitely what people are feeling in the UK. And here's the thing. This is a logical response to what? To what we know about the science. When we look at the science, it's clear that we're conducting an unprecedented experiment with our only home. The IPCC tells us, and paleoclimate records make it clear, that our warming today is unprecedented in the history of humans on this planet. Every single headline we see, yesterday it was the floods in Australia. The week before that, it was the floods in the US. We see wildfires and heat waves, droughts and storms. Almost every headline we see is showing how climate change is loading the weather dice against us, making our heat waves more dangerous, our droughts more intense, our wildfires burn greater area, our storms dump more water on us. And why does this affect us? It matters to us because it affects everything that we depend on for life: the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food that we eat, the nature that surrounds us that we ourselves are part of, and all of our infrastructure, which was designed for a planet that no longer exists. When it comes to what's happening, it truly is not about saving the planet as if we have to choose between people or the planet, or the environment versus the economy. The reality is nothing we have can float around in outer space without the resources that this planet provides. And that's why when it came to titling my book, I didn't call it Saving the Planet, I called it Saving Us, where us refers to humans and to many of the living things that share this planet with us, who are similarly at risk from the fastest changes in climate that we have seen. So this begs another question. Not only where do we find hope, but why aren't we acting at speed to fix it? So I want to answer this question right now, but as I go along, I want to invite you at any time, using the same poll everywhere tool that you just used, to put your questions in for Ed and I. Because after this, we're going to be taking your questions, and here's the fun part. You can put in your own question, or you can look at other people's questions and you can upvote their questions. So the questions that you most want us to get to are the ones that we will get to, and we need your help to identify those questions. So remember, anytime as we go along, you can put your questions in pollev.com/Katharine, and you can also look at other people's questions and upvote them. But before we go to your questions, I want to answer this pressing question I raised, which is, why aren't we acting? And so we often think if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds. And this is a cartoon from a little global weirding episode, one of our global weirding episodes on YouTube. But we've known the facts for over 150 years. And then we think, all right, well, everybody just needs to be worried because me and everybody I work with, we're worried. But if I ask that question, how does climate change make you feel, if the general public, they wouldn't be worried. They'd say, who cares, climate change, what's the big deal? This is what we think. But here's the thing. I've asked this question of almost any groups you can imagine. I've asked parents and grandparents. I've asked school children. I've asked people of faith. I've asked community organizations. I've asked business leaders. I've asked business people. I've asked academics. I've asked policymakers and decision makers. I've asked almost anyone you can imagine this question. And I've looked very carefully at the polling data. And both my own sampling and the polling data is very clear that this image does not represent reality. In reality, we are worried. But here's the thing. If we think people aren't worried, then we think, well, climate's changing and I'm worried, and all of us here are worried, all of us on this webinar are worried. Everybody else needs to be worried. So I'm going to load up the scariest facts we have. I'm going to tell them about the polar bears and the ice sheets and the accelerating uptake of heat in the ocean in exajoules. And surely that will motivate them to action. But here's the thing. If we're already worried, but we don't know what to do, more scary facts just cause our defense mechanisms to kick in. And this is not speaking specifically about climate change. This is speaking about how our human brain works. In fact, a neuroscientist, Tali Sherrod, explains in a really good book she has called The Influential Mind, how fear and anxiety cause us humans, it's the way our brains are wired, to withdraw, to freeze, to give up, rather than taking action. So ironically, the very thing that we think, and it's not just us, most of the journalism stories about climate change are also fear-based stories. So we as a society think, oh, well, if people just were more afraid and more anxious, they would act more. It turns out that's not the way our brains are wired. What do we really need? Well, first of all, we need to understand that this is not a true picture of where people are at. The true picture of where people are at looks more like this. Most people are worried. So I live in the US where 70% of people are worried. I'm from Canada where about 75% of people are worried. In the UK, it's similar numbers. In France, it's as high as 86%, I believe. If you ask mothers in the US, 83% of them are worried. Young people in 10 countries around the world, 86% of them are worried. Most of us are worried. But only a tiny group of us are activated. In fact, these circles are not really to scale. The activated and not worried group should be even smaller. Well, if that's the case, you might say, well, then why aren't people doing anything about it? Why aren't they even talking about it more? Because if we don't know what to do, we don't want to talk about it because it just makes us more anxious. And that's the beginning of the answer to the question. If this is truly the picture that we have, then our approach should be very different. We're not trying to focus on the small yellow group. We're trying to focus on taking the big blue group and moving them over to the green group. And for the blue group to get to the green group, what do they need to know? It's not about the polar bears and the ice sheets. It's about how it matters to them and what they can do to make a difference. When we look at how we feel about climate change, again, most people are worried, but half of us feel hopeless and don't know where to start. And probably another 25% feel this way, but they just don't want to admit it. Like I said, only a small percentage are activated. And what's holding us back? Two things that I unpack in the book, but I'll give them to you here because this is not a mystery novel or suspense novel. I want you to know what we found. We don't understand why it matters so urgently to us here and now, and we don't know what we can do to fix it. I am not a prime minister. I'm not a CEO. I'm not a big influential person with, gazillions of followers on social media. For a climate scientist, I personally have a lot of followers, and a lot means like 200,000. There are cats that have many more followers than climate scientists do. We don't understand why it matters, and we don't know what we can do to fix it. So here's what we need to talk about, where we need to start. We need to start by, first of all, addressing psychological distance. Most people are worried, but they still see climate change as far away in time or space, as abstract global average temperature, rather than right here, the heat wave that's driving up my power bills. So we have to talk about climate change in a way that brings it close. How it's now, not the future. Here, not over there or at the poles. Concrete, what's happening in my life today? It's affecting the coffee I drink. It's affecting the flood risk of my home. It's affecting my insurance rates. It's affecting the availability of food, or the fact that my child can't practice their favorite sport anymore in the middle of the day because it's too hot. We have to bring it here and now and make it concrete and relevant. And to do that, we have to talk about how climate change affects us and what we can do to fix it. So what's the first step? Well, I was talking to people in the state of Iowa a few months ago, and they said, okay, so that sounds fine, but how do you talk about polar bears here in Iowa? I said, well, unless there's a secret population of polar bears that we don't know about in Iowa, you don't. What do you talk about? Well, when I'm in Texas or Iowa, I talk about farming. If I'm somewhere that's prone to wildfires, we definitely talk about that. If we see flooding, like the massive flooding that we're experiencing right now, we're seeing in Australia, and then they saw in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands last summer. If we're looking at drought, we show people how to care about climate change. You don't have to be an environmentalist. You don't have to be somebody who considers themselves to be green. You only have to be one thing. And that one thing is quite literally a human being living on this planet. But that's not enough. That's only the first side of the coin. There's a second side of the coin too. Now, after I explain this coin, we're going to take your questions. So don't forget to go to polev.com/Katharine, look at what other people have written, and upvote the ones you're most interested in. But I want to talk about the second half of the coin before we get there. The first half is how climate change matters here and now to us in concrete and relevant ways. I hear from people all the time who started conversations over the fact that they garden and their friends do too. The fact that they're worried about the wildfire smoke in the air that their children are breathing in, and people around them are too. The fact that people at their organization want to do something about climate change together and make a difference. talk about how it affects us here and now, and talk about what we can do to fix it. Because it turns out that people are willing to change if they have something very important: efficacy. If they believe that what they can do can make a difference. And it turns out right now, the biggest thing we're lacking is not worry, concern, fear, or anxiety. We have that in spades. The biggest thing we're lacking is efficacy. We don't think we can make a difference. And if we don't think we can make a difference, we do nothing. So often today, people ask me, what can I do? And my answer is do something, anything, and talk about it. Because talking is the catalyst. Talking engages us in co-creating a vision that we're lacking, that vision of a better world. And that's where hope comes in. Not the type of hope where you're burying your head in the sand like the mythical ostrich, hoping that if we just sort of hide our head, it'll go away or somebody else will fix it. When everything's going well or everything's going to turn out well, you don't need hope. We need hope when things are not going well. We need hope when things are bad. We need hope to start with recognizing it's bad and it's going to get worse. Success is not inevitable or even entirely probable. But what real hope does is it provides a vision of a better outcome or future and a path to get there. Hope is tied to action. Here's someone who knows a little bit about action, Greta Thunberg, and here's something that she said, I think that's very profound. She said, the one thing we need more than hope is action, because once we start to act, hope is everywhere. We see the efficacy once we open our eyes to all the actions that people are doing around us. We realize they're not presidents, prime ministers, or CEOs, yet they're making a difference. Maybe I could too. And then you might say, well, where do I start? Just before COVID, one of the last talks I gave was at a very large church in Southern Ontario, close to my home. And as people were leaving, I was standing by the door listening to people. And I heard one woman walking out, talking to her friend. She said, I've always been worried about climate change. Sound familiar? And then she said, but I didn't know what to do about it. So I did nothing. But now she said, I do know what to do. I learned, one of the things I talked about was how we can make a difference. She said, I learned that food waste is a huge source of carbon emissions. And so we're going to eat the Christmas leftovers. Now, do eating the Christmas leftovers really make a difference with global climate change? Technically, no, not at all. It's not even a drop in the bucket. But what happened? She moved from the blue group to the green group. And pretty soon that church had a creation care committee. Pretty soon they were taking actions to look at the energy used by the building itself and what the church itself could do to make a difference. And how do we catalyze all of this? By doing something that we're not doing. What are we not doing? Well, it turns out that, and this is a map for the US, but it applies generally across almost every high-income country I've been to. Most of us are worried and we think it's happening, but we aren't talking about it. We aren't talking about it. Why not? Because we have no sense of efficacy. And if you're worried about something and you don't know what to do about it, talking about it generally just makes you feel worse, not better. So our defense mechanism is to avoid it. Yet if we do talk about it, but again, talk about why it matters here and now to us in personal ways and talk about what real solutions look like, that's where we kick over the first domino in the long chain that leads to a better future. As George Marshall, who's an expert in climate communication from the Climate Outreach Program, says, talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. But the goal of the conversation is not to tell people about climate change. Rather, it is to expand the number of people in the conversation. And how do we do that? We do that by beginning with what we have in common. Step number one is to bond over something we share. Connect the dots to climate change, and then bring in positive, constructive solutions that you could do personally and they could too, that your company could do personally, that another company is already doing, that your city could do personally, that another city is doing, that your organization could do, that another organization is doing. use that conversation as a catalyst, because when we look at how the world has changed before, and believe me, our modern industrialized society has changed significantly in massive ways over the last few hundred years. When we look at the catalysts for social change, those catalysts were what? They were people, ordinary people, people of no particular fame or repute or reputation or wealth, but they were people who decided the world could and should be different, who realized that it's bad and it could get worse, but there is a small chance of a better future. And if we do everything we can to get there, the world can and must change. We are the people who've changed the world before, and we are the ones who can and must change it again. And it all begins with having that conversation about why climate change matters and about what we together can do to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That was a wonderful overview and greatly appreciated. And I can see that the questions are coming flooding in, which is excellent, and we'll open them up in a moment to you. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions myself, if that's all right. And the first one is for you to say a little bit more about your faith. You are a distinguished climate scientist. You were also, I understand, a person of deep personal faith. And I wondered whether you could comment on that duality, in a sense, that you have in your own life.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to what I was alluding to without using the word, which is that it's not just about our head, it's about our heart and our hands. So we have a lot of information in our heads, and we've had this information for decades and even centuries. Climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, our future's in our hands. But what we most need to do is we need to connect our head to our heart. Why do we care? What is it that we are already passionate about? What defines our life that makes us the perfect person to care? And then connect our heart to our hands. What can we do to make a difference? Each of us is unique. We all come from a different set of background, values, life experiences, priorities. And so we often think, well, everybody has to care because I care. I hear this from people who say, well, you know, everybody needs to, how do I make people care about nature first? Because if we care about nature, then everybody will care about climate change. Well, that is true. And I think people should care about nature because we're part of nature. We can't survive without it. It seems obvious to me. But saying everybody has to care about X first before we care about climate change means everybody has to go through my gate. It's like saying everybody must become a birder to care about climate change. And I personally, full disclosure, I'm not a birder. I appreciate people who do, but that is not me. Or it's like saying everybody needs to become a football fan because football is one of the sports that's being affected by climate change to care about climate change. No, each of us has to find the reasons why we care. And for many of us, the vast majority of people in the world, many of our values come from our faith, whether we actively practice it today or not. And for me as a Christian, I truly believe that we humans have a responsibility to care for every living thing on this planet, which includes our sisters and our brothers, as well as plants and animals and every other living thing. And I also believe that we are to be recognized by our love for others. And so what made me become a climate scientist, my undergraduate degree is actually in astrophysics. What made me switch fields and become a climate scientist was when I realized that climate change affects all of us, but it doesn't affect us all equally. It affects the poorest and most vulnerable the most. The ones who've done the least to contribute to the problem are already bearing the brunt of the impacts, and that is not fair. So it was my heart rather than my head that led me to become a climate scientist. And for all of us, we each have every reason we need to care, and so does everybody else. And our job is not to convince them to care for the same reason we do, but to help them see through what we have in common with them that who they are is already the perfect person to care.
Thank you, Katharine. My next question, and then we're going to open it up, is about politics. A lot of the action you describe at the individual level, I think in your book, you argue, manifests itself in the political realm. And I think you make the case that, in a sense, politics is everything. Individual action is incredibly important, but a lot of it comes down to political will. Could you comment on politics?
I definitely could. And of course, I live in the United States where politics is incredibly frustrating and seems to be moving backwards rather than even just staying the same every day. In many ways, people say one of the biggest questions I get these days is how can you find hope when you look at what, for example, the federal government of the United States is doing? And the answer is that when I look at the rulings and the policies that have come forward lately, especially from the Supreme Court, it's very difficult to find hope in that. Because really, it's not moving in the right direction at all. And in many ways, at the federal or national level, that's almost the last place where we're going to be seeing significant action. Even in Canada and the UK where I live, it seems like we take 2 steps forward, then we take 1 step back. And I know there's UK headlines just recently talking about investment in fossil fuels and new fossil fuel leases off the coast, just at a time when the UK is committed and has committed for quite a few years to significantly reducing its emissions. But when we look at what's happening below that, we see huge amounts of action. When we look at, even in the US, what the federal government, who's the biggest vehicle fleet owner and land and building owner in the US, what they're doing to cut their own emissions. When we look at what companies are doing, when we see the big announcement yesterday that 35 faith-based institutions representing $1.25 billion worth of investments have announced they're divesting from fossil fuels. When we look at what schools and universities are doing, what grandparents and young people are doing, when we look at what people are doing around the world, we realize that giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of an incredibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it. Greta Thunberg, Sir David Attenborough, yours and maybe mine. No, that giant boulder is already at the top of the hill. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. And if I add mine, and if I use my voice to encourage everyone around me to add theirs, it will go faster, so fast that eventually none of our national governments can ignore it.
Thank you, Katharine. I'm now going to ask you to put the poll of questions up on your screen. Are you able to do that? Because there's been some very interesting questions. And
yes, I can absolutely do that. And I have not been looking at the questions yet, so I don't know what we're going to have.
Well, so whilst you call them up, I will give you a flavour of them in no particular order. But there's certainly a question for you about Canada, actually, and what more could be done in Canada. There's a question about, there's quite a few questions about nature. There's questions about Glastonbury and waste at Glastonbury, climate change and emotion. But some of the highest voted questions are now on the screen. So perhaps we could start with those and work through them. Do you want to read out the first one?
Yes. So the first one is a very good question. And that is, I should mention too, after what gives you hope, the second most common question I get is, how do I talk to fill in the blank about climate change? And sometimes that question is, how do I talk to politicians? And my answer is, politicians are humans too. They're a special type of human, but still human. And politicians have things they care about. They have goals they want to achieve. They have things that matter to them. And what they need to see is the same thing every single one of us needs to see, which is that they will not achieve their long-term goals and even some of their short-term goals if they leave climate change out of the picture. That's the first side of the coin. But what's the second side of the coin? The second side of the coin is that there are solutions that provide benefits today as well as tomorrow. There are solutions that can grow jobs in their constituency, that can show people that they care about people who live there and vote for them, that can make them an even more genuine expression of who they already are. And so that is why, if I have a choice of where to spend my time, I often spend my time with politicians or with organizations who work with politicians to the right-hand side of the political spectrum. At least I try to, because they're the ones who really need to be bringing forward the solutions that are consistent and compatible with people who have conservative ideology. A thermometer is not red or blue or green or orange, but there's no right solution. We need our politicians to be arguing over the best solutions. We need a competition among politicians to come up with the best solutions. That is their job. And we need to empower them to do so by showing them how the head connects to the heart, connects to the hands, how what they care about is already being affected by climate change today, and how there are solutions that are consistent with their ideology and with their values and their priorities. It's not easy. Politicians are a hard group to speak to, but we really, really can if we spend the time figuring out what makes them tick first.
Thank you, Katharine. Your next question is about nature, close to your professional life.
So this is a great question. I've highlighted it here on the screen so you can see it, but you can still be upvoting questions as we go along. This is really important because we're confronting three crises right now. We are confronting the climate crisis, where climate is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization and much of the life on this planet. We are confronting the biodiversity crisis, where we have lost 70% of our biodiversity biomass since the 1970s. And we're also confronting a pollution crisis, which is exacerbating the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. All of these together put us and many of the other living things that share this home with us at risk. But the good news is, through the work of organizations like the Nature Conservancy, which I now serve as their chief scientist, I've just fulfilled 1 year with the organization, there are organizations who are working very hard to turn this around. Through showing how nature-based solutions that pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in the soils and the ecosystems where we want it, nature-based solutions provide both short-term benefits and a long-term way to address climate change. How do we do that? Well, planting trees, of course, is the first thing that jumps into people's minds. And planting trees, of course, does help because trees take up carbon as they grow. But preventing the degradation of ecosystems, protecting them, restoring them, investing in coastal marshes and wetlands and peatlands and mangrove forests, investing in smart regenerative agriculture that reduces the impact of drought and helps to grow more food, especially in some of the poorest parts of the world, while simultaneously putting carbon back in the soil. Using techniques that have been used for a very long time, like biochar, where you burn agricultural residue at high temperature and you plow that carbon back into the soil where it acts like an amazing fertilizer. We are finally starting to move in the right direction because people are becoming much more aware, beginning with many of our farmers. They're becoming much more aware that what we do with our land matters profoundly to us today, as well as to the future of all of us tomorrow. So I do see things changing and moving in the right direction. Why? Because people have followed the pattern I just talked about. We need to talk about the first side of the coin, which is the risks here and now to things that matter to us. But we also need to talk about positive, constructive solutions, and nature-based solutions are incredibly positive, incredibly constructive, and they're quite literally something that people can do in their backyard, can help out with in their local community, and can implement at the scale of an entire country.
Thank you, Katharine. And when you mentioned entire country there, my mind immediately flew to the great forest basins of the world, the Amazon rainforest and the Congo basin, forests of Indonesia. Some of these countries and regions where there are some extraordinary places still in the world which we must protect urgently. The next question for you is what is the most important practical thing I can do with my kids? Do you want to take that one on?
Oh, yes, I'm a mother. So yes, I can definitely do this one. Well, with our kids, most of them, they get it. The best age that I've ever spoken to in terms of a group of people who really get it and want to do whatever they can are grade 3 children. So they understand, but what they most need, what our kids need is efficacy, even more than we adults do, an understanding of what they can do to make a difference. So that's why I helped to co-found an organization called Science Moms. You can find it online at sciencemoms.com. You have to spell moms the US way, which is MOMS, sciencemoms.com. And there we provide all kinds of resources, from books to read to your kids or with your kids, movies to watch with them, activities to do with them, information to share with them. And that information, again, really has to focus on what we can do to make a difference, and even what kids are doing to make a difference. So I mentioned my Global Weirding series earlier on YouTube. And the Global Weirding episodes are all created to answer frequently asked questions. And one of the frequently asked questions I get is, I'm just a kid, what can I do? So I started to research what kids are doing. And let me tell you, kids are phenomenal. What they are doing all around the world just blows your mind, whether it's inventing $5 machines that charge your cell phone using the sun or the wind, or helping their city create climate action plans, or writing legislation for their government that's dropping the ball on not writing climate legislation. Kids are doing phenomenal things. And of course, they're suing their federal governments for the right to a better future. And of course, there are the children's and the young people's climate strikes as well. Kids are just going amazingly all around the world. I've been interviewed by 9-year-olds on their podcasts. I've talked to kids who are just doing inspiring, incredible work. So the biggest thing we can do with our kids is say, let's look at what other kids are doing, because you know what? You truly can make a difference. And it reminds me of a number of years ago when I was giving a talk in Edinburgh. Whenever I travel, I always in person, I try to do as many things in one place as I humanly can. And so I had squeezed in an extra talk on Sunday night at a church in Edinburgh, which was actually a discussion with Alistair McIntosh, who some of you may know. He's a human ecologist from Glasgow who studies how people interact with land, and with John Sturrock, who's a professional mediator who's done quite a bit of work in Scotland. So we were having this discussion, and there was a man there who works at a renewable energy company, and he had to bring his young son with him because he didn't have a babysitter. And his son said, "Oh, Dad, do I have to go to this, event?" And his dad said, "Well, just bring a book, you can read, it's okay." So he brought his son, and he looks over about halfway through, and his son is absolutely glued to the discussion that we're having, which is definitely not for kids. And then as they're leaving, his son says to him, "Dad, I have to do something about this." And his dad said, "It's okay, I work for a renewable energy company, I'm taking care of it." And his son said, "No, you don't understand, I need to do something too." So he decided all on his own that he was going to start a club at his school, because he realized that nobody was turning off the lights and everybody was putting the rubbish or the recycling in the rubbish bin or the rubbish in the recycling bin, and people weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So he started this club, and his dad said it changed his life at school. Every day he'd come home, he'd say, "Miss Harris put the paper in the garbage bin instead of in the recycling, and we told her to take it out." And you wouldn't believe they left the lights on in the gym again, and we told them it's time to turn those lights off. It completely changed how he interacted with his peers, with his school, that sense of responsibility, agency, and efficacy he felt, because you know what? He wasn't just changing what he did, he was changing all of the people around him. By what? By using his voice to talk about why it mattered and what they could do to fix it. So every single one of us can act, and we can learn so much from our kids on recognizing how we as individuals can make a difference.
Thank you very, very much, Katharine. Now, there are some more questions. The next one on the screen, I think, is about nature again, and it follows a very similar line of argument to the one you addressed a moment ago. So I was going to propose that we moved on to the next one, which I think is about corporate power and some of the world's biggest businesses and the role that they play, often a negative role, but also the role that some of them are playing. But many of them are undermining climate action, but some of them are also trying to do good. And perhaps you could comment on the corporate question. The one after that, I think, is about young people feeling utterly powerless, and that came through a lot in these questions. So those two, I think, come next.
Yes, absolutely. Well, actually, first, since we're talking about young people and kids and communicating, let's talk about the ones about kids feeling powerless, and about how do we get people to engage and talk about climate first. So let me exit out of this so I can see you a little better. And you all can, of course, see the questions at any time on Poll EV as well. They're right in front of you. So where does our hopelessness come from? It comes from an awareness, a logical, rational awareness of how bad this is, without any sense of efficacy or what we can do to make a difference. That's where we lose our hope. When we understand how bad it is, we understand why it matters, but we don't know what we can do to fix it. Joan Baez is a singer from the 1960s, and she said the antidote to despair is action. And it's not feeling hopeful first and then acting next. It's acting and then we find hope. Practicing active hope by looking at what people are doing. Engaging with others who are making a difference in our community, in our organization, in our group. Having conversations with the people that we walk our dog with the people that we play football with or kayak with the people that we see at our child's school, with the people we work with every day. Change begins when someone, anyone, catalyzes that change by talking about why it matters and by talking about what we can do to fix it. So somebody said, well, how do I get people to engage? And especially, and they asked specifically on social media. And that's something I think a lot about too, because I want to use social media as a tool for good. And it's only effective if we actually meet people where they're at. So what do we have to do? We have to start with where they're at, not where we are at. One woman wrote in, she said, I read your book and I really enjoyed it, but I can't get through to my friend. All she cares about is Wordle and travel. And I've tried telling her how traveling produces so many carbon emissions and how can she travel and why does she do that? And she just switches me off. I'm like, well, that's a shock. I love it when people judge me. I say, please give me more. Just kidding. None of us like being judged and guilted and shamed. And you know what? I would bet you any money that her friend is worried about climate change, but she doesn't know what to do about it. She doesn't think there are solutions that will leave her better off than she is today. So she's decided to pull the blanket back up over her head and go back to bed, so to speak. Nothing I can do about it. So eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So making someone more worried and more anxious isn't going to fix the problem. So I said to her, and I wasn't actually even joking, I said, did you know there's something called the greener Wordle? So after you've done the traditional Wordle, you can do the greener Wordle that uses green words. Now, I know that might sound trivial, but it's a way to get that input coming to your brain about why these things matter to us and how we all share this one world together. And then with travel, there's so much that can be done. Talking to people about how they can make a difference, about how we travel, about exploring different places and getting there in different ways, about engaging with virtual travel, about reducing everything we can first. And then there is a role for offsets at the end after we've mitigated all of our emissions that we can. Ways, and not just about travel, but ways that she can enrich her life and have a better life, not a worse life, through climate solutions. So when people don't engage with us, it's because we're not meeting them where they're at. And we have to figure out, where are they at? Are they passionate about sports or gardening or the place where they live or their children or their grandchildren? What matters to them? And then when you post something that matters to them, it's like, oh, then they're interested. So there's people who post about how climate change affects tennis. There's people who post about how climate change affects wine. You can post about how climate change is affecting the place where you live. But most of all, and I've noticed, especially on Facebook, most of all, and the question did refer to Facebook, when I post about positive, constructive solutions, that's what gets the biggest engagement. Because what are we missing? We're not missing anxiety, worry, concern, fear. We got that in spades. We're missing efficacy. We don't understand how we can fix it. So when we talk about a single man who turned his whole front yard into a garden and a butterfly and an insect habitat, we think, that's not so far off. I could do some of that. When we hear about somebody who got their whole cafeteria to start reducing their food waste and offer more plant-based meals, we think, oh, that's just a single cafeteria. I know the people who work in my cafeteria, maybe I could mention it to them. When we see what real solutions look like, that's what empowers us. And that's what we need to engage people with. Why it matters here and now in ways that already matter to us and what those solutions look like.
Thank you, Katharine. The question about corporate power is about corporates blocking action, but there's also a question from Erin Schott in the chat about the risk of greenwashing, in a sense, particularly with so-called nature-based solutions, where some corporates are buying offsets, as you mentioned, and not acting to reduce their emissions in the core of their operations. Could you comment on the role of the corporates, the role of corporate power?
Absolutely. And that's interesting because it's something that I'm going to be talking about later today with a group of organizations and businesses. So first of all, just to be clear, the atmosphere cares about how much carbon is in it. So if we reduce the amount and eliminate the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, that doesn't increase the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. But if we increase nature-based solutions, the drain in the swimming pool, so to speak, to take carbon out of the atmosphere, that also affects levels of carbon in the atmosphere. And what matters to the atmosphere is how much carbon is in it, which is the sum of what goes in and what comes out. So the scientific case for nature-based solutions is very clear. But first of all, those solutions have to actually take carbon out of the atmosphere. And they have to do it over a long period of time, at least 100 years, to make a difference to us with our civilization and our future plans. So if you invest in some quick fix, planting a bunch of trees that aren't planted in the right place and they just die the next year, that's not going to do the job. Also, if those nature-based solutions are achieved or accomplished through infringing on the rights of people, especially, as Arent pointed out, Indigenous peoples who have already lost so much, if those nature-based solutions are infringing on their rights, that is not a long-term solution either, because Indigenous management of land is a climate solution. Their practices are shown to be climate friendly as compared to our practices, which most of which are not. So when we look at nature-based solutions, typically the discussion tends to focus at one end of the spectrum or the other. I hear articles, I see movies, I hear people claiming that nature-based solutions are the silver bullet that will fix everything. And I also hear that nature-based solutions are absolutely horrible, no good, should never be used under any circumstances. No, 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 no. That's what I hear. I hear discussion at both ends of the spectrum, black and white. And the answer is, as always, in the middle. Nature-based solutions, it's going to be impossible for us to meet our 1.5-degree goal without them. But nature-based solutions must be done right, with permanence, with longevity, with monitoring, with verification. And that's why I'm so excited about all of the efforts that are coming online to really monitor and verify these nature-based solutions. And they must be done in participation and collaboration with local communities to enhance their quality of life, to provide the short-term co-benefits to air, water, habitat, land, and economy, as well as to take up carbon long-term.
Thank you very much, Katharine. I'm going to ask next to come back to politics and a question that actually got the biggest number of hands. And I think you've already addressed it in part, but how can we convince politicians to make addressing climate change a cross-party issue so that they're not frightened of making unpopular policy choices that might jeopardize their election chances?
Well, first of all, using your voice to tell your politicians why you care is really, really important. Bill McKibben, you may know him. He is an excellent author and thinker on climate issues. And one of the things he said that I quote in my book is this: the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. And one of the biggest ways we can not be such an individual, so to speak, is by engaging in our political systems, by making our priorities clear. But at its core, resistance to climate action is not lack of information, knowledge, awareness, or even concern over climate change. It is solution aversion. We, politicians more than anyone, don't think that there's solutions they can get on board with. So let me give you an example from my neck of the woods. I live in one of the most conservative parts of a very politically conservative state in the United States. And for a long time, we no longer do, but for a long time, we had a conservative elected official who was well known, and I'd seen him do this myself, for giving long lectures and talks on how climate change was a hoax. It was just a natural cycle. It was, made up by the liberals to increase the size of big government. I mean, he would, if anybody said the words climate change, he was right there telling you it wasn't real, it didn't matter, it wasn't serious, and we didn't need to fix it. So one day, coming back from a climate science center meeting, one of my colleagues found himself on the airplane sitting beside this politician. And he was a friendly person, so they started to chat, and the politician said, oh, well, what do you do? Where are you coming back from? And so my colleague sort of took a deep breath and said, I'm coming back from a meeting of researchers who study climate change and its impact on our region. And the politician said, climate change, that's one of the biggest threats facing our region. I'm very worried about, and I'm paraphrasing here because I wasn't there, but I'm very worried about the drought and the extreme heat. My colleague had to pick his jaw up off the floor. That was not what he was expecting at all. But what did that show? It showed that most people, even people who stand up in public and say we don't need to act, they understand the risks. That's the first side of the coin, but they don't understand what they can do about it. They often feel painted into a corner, and they've got a paintbrush in their own hand too. There's personal responsibility there. they feel painted into a corner because they don't think there's solutions that are compatible with their values. And that is why I love organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby, for example, that started in the US, but is active in every continent around the world now, that works tirelessly across the aisle, showing conservative politicians how there are conservative policy solutions to climate change, that they can get on board with it without compromising, as they view it, their values or their priorities. And so it really is important to help them find solutions that work for them, because we want our politicians arguing, because as long as we have two humans on the planet, we'll have two politicians arguing with each other. But we want them arguing over who can find the best solution to climate change.
Thank you so much, Katharine. I'm going to ask you just one more question and then give you the opportunity to close. And I think when you close, you might return to your opening poll. Is that right? So my last question for you really is, my grandfather used to say, and I think my uncle might be on this call as well, that humanity or humankind was sort of half angel, half devil in some way. You know, the best of us are altruistic, the best of our spirit, all of us, is altruistic and generous, but the worst of the human character or spirit can also be cruel and awful and selfish and so on. And in my darker moments, I wonder whether humanity has it within itself to address this crisis that we're in the way that's required, whether we can, in a sense, overcome the selfishness that we have as part of our evolutionary setup in some way. So in my darker moments, I worry that it's just not in us somehow to do what's required. And in my more optimistic moments, I'm completely with you on the ethical value of doing everything that we can. So I just wanted to offer you the chance again to come back to us with your sense of whether humanity, in a sense, is up to the task before us. Thanks, Katharine.
Well, you've really hit the nail on the head there, Ed, because when people ask me as a climate scientist, can we meet our ambitious targets? My answer is, as a scientist, I can't answer that question because it's up to us. Collectively, it's up to us humans to make that decision. And when it really comes down to it, we would be making that decision, like I said, for all the reasons we already have. Whoever we are, whatever we care about, wherever we live, whoever we love, all of those things are already being affected by climate change. So we don't have to make people altruistic people who care about the future, but not about their lives today, or about people or nature who live over there, but not about here. No, climate change is already affecting us now. It's already affecting us here where we live. It's already affecting us in ways that we care about. And helping people see that who they are is the perfect person to care already, and that climate action is actually a genuine expression of who they are rather than fighting against their selfish nature. I think that is absolutely key to climate solutions, because as long as we think it's a choice between us versus them, my life now versus people in the future or people over there, we're never going to fix this problem. But when we realize that we're fighting for everyone and everything and everywhere that we already love and hold dear today, then again, that makes us the perfect person to care. So let me just summarize, go back to my slides here. Remember, I showed that diagram where I said, you know, if we think people aren't worried and we're worried, actually, let me pull it up right here, just a second here. Here we go. If climate changes and we get worried and we think nobody else is worried, what we do is we try to make them more worried by dumping a lot of scary, true facts on them. But if we realize that we could share how it affects us and them in ways they already care about, and what positive solutions look like, it turns out people feel empowered, and that's where action results, because that's the way our brains are wired. It turns out, going back to the neuroscience, and this is another quote from the same woman I quoted before, Tali Sharot, she said, the human brain is built to associate forward action, which is what we need, with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message, and she isn't actually talking about climate change here, but she actually is talking about climate change, right? Reframe your message so the information you provide will induce hope, not dread. That's what we need to know. We need to show people, again, how that giant boulder is not sitting at the bottom of the hill with only a few hands on it. It is already at the top of the hill. It's rolling down the hill in the right direction. And if we add our hand and if we encourage others to add theirs, it will go faster. So I have one last question for you now. If you don't mind going back to polev.com/Katharine, click on the link in the chat, it'll take you right there. Or if you're already there, you might already have it open. And now I want to ask you this question. Now, after our discussion, after everything we've talked about here so far today, when I say climate change, give me one word. How do you feel? I love that the first word was empowered because, and I love that the biggest word now is hope, because where do we find our hope? We find it in action. And we may be frustrated, but I would encourage you, don't keep banging your head against the same brick wall. Look around you for a door somewhere else. You might not be talking to the people that you can engage with most effectively. You might not be working with the organization that's ready to move, but believe me, there are people who are ready to move in this world. So look around and find a place where you can make a difference with what you know, with how you're engaged, and make that difference by talking about why it matters and by talking about what we can do together to fix it. Our role is not to change the world. Our role is to be that catalyst. Wherever we are, wherever we live, wherever we work, to be the catalyst of change, because that is how the world changes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That's been a really inspiring session. Thank you all so much for joining. This will become a Green Alliance podcast, and it will also go on the YouTube channel of Green Alliance. And we're very thankful to Green Alliance for hosting us, and to you, Katharine, for taking the time. Thank you, everyone.